Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. And joining me in studio, State Representative Dustin Burrows. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Chad.
Oh, wait a minute. Joey's got to turn on you. There we go.
Okay.
Now we got you.
Well, I was just saying Happy New Year. Happy to be back on the show.
Yeah, glad to have you. How was your Christmas and New Year's?
Oh, it was great. I have 3 little boys, and at least the littlest one is more excited about the boxes and wrapping paper, and it's fun to watch them get into everything.
Yeah, well, appreciate you joining us today. You had an editorial over the weekend in the AJ and dealing with property tax reform. The AJ thought property tax reform was, I guess, a pretty big deal last year.
Yeah, I guess in the New Year's Eve edition, they went through some of the top stories in Lubbock, and we, the state legislature, happened to make number 1. Oh. And specifically talking about our attempts to reform and, put some safety valves on property taxes. And, it was one of Abbott's initiatives, especially during the special session, a bill that I co-authored. And, I wanted to talk a little more about that and add some more, facets to the story as we go forward. It looks like, during 2018, leading up to the 2019 session, this is going to be an issue that's revisited over and over again. And so I thought there was just some things that, would help flesh out the conversation a little bit. And so I wrote the op-ed on that.
Well, and one of the things that you took issue with, and it's not only the AJ that's done this, but Dallas Morning News, Houston Chronicle, they do not talk to a lot of voters. They talk to elected officials who just about every single elected official, except I know one city council person who was the only one who was like, sounds great to me. But just about every other elected official on the local or, county level was against what y'all were trying to do.
When we tried to do this, we heard, obviously from the organizations like TML and TAC, and those are, lobby groups for, taxing entities essentially. And they represent the cities and they represent, counties, and they really don't like the idea of the state controlling property taxes or putting some safety valves on it. Even though we've done it for 40 or 50 years, the Dallas Morning News and others try to make this sound like some sort of radical new idea. So what I pointed out is, number 1, is if we're going to talk about property taxes, we're going to have a conversation, let's hear from some taxpayers. Let's hear from some of the people who call my office, who post on my Facebook page, who talk about how difficult it is to afford just to live, how property taxes continue to rise, how they're worried about, if they miss a paycheck, losing their home potentially. And it's not just, of course, property taxes. It's just people are struggling, whether it's health insurance, whether it's lower wages, a lot of things. People are hurting. But if we're going to talk about property taxes, let's talk to the people who are struggling to pay them and make them part of the story, because that's who I hear from and that's who I represent.
And why don't we hear that side of the story? Yeah, I mean, you're hearing that side, but why aren't the rest of us hearing that side of the story?
I don't know. It's what we hear from in my office all the time. It's, what I want to tell. I think when I posted the op-ed, there was a comment or two about, people who think their property taxes has doubled over the past few years. And I mean, it really does affect them. And so they need to be talked to, and, they need to have a voice in the conversation as we go forward. And we talk about, how much do we want to tax? We need to make sure that their seat is at the table and their voices are heard and their struggles are understood.
Personally, when I'm, interviewing a lot of candidates who come through this studio and some of those who are running on the county level, this is something that I think should be a big discussion because the county, or at least 2 of the Lubbock County commissioners, had a lot to say in opposition to what y'all were trying to do. What exactly are Republicans, or at least some Republicans, trying to do in the legislature when it comes to property taxes, and how would that impact specifically Lubbock County and other counties in your area?
Yeah, let me first start by saying, there's a lot of things that I agree on with my local elected officials, and we work together on a lot of different issues. I mean, We just do, and I could go through a great list and talk about all the things where we just have a lot of agreement on. What we tried to do last session, and this is what it was really about, is since the 70s, the state of Texas has put some limits and some abilities to make sure that you can't raise taxes without having the citizens have a right to protest. And currently, citizens can protest a large tax raise by getting enough signatures on a petition if the effective tax rate goes over a certain percentage. It was originally 5% back in the 70s when this law was passed, like almost every other state has. It was raised to 8% because of hyperinflation under the Carter administration. And there's been multiple attempts to lower it back down to 5%. And the best part about it is make the elections automatic rather than by petition. Yeah. And so what it says is look, if you're a local taxing entity, and you think you need to raise more money than the effective tax rate, go make your case to the citizens, and they're going to get to validate it right then and there. It gives citizens the ultimate local control over that. And so it's putting some safety valves on potentially high-rising property taxes. It was Abbott's initiative. I co-authored it. I supported it, and I think it's going to be back in 2019.
Now, a lot of the counties, specifically in your area, were against this, right?
Well, the people I talked to, a lot of them are for it.
The people, but not the elected officials.
I heard from some of my local electeds that, essentially said, no, we, don't want any limits.
What is their argument on it, especially in the more rural areas?
Well, they use this phrase, local control, that somehow that, the state shouldn't come in there and put these new regulations on making sure that property taxes can't rise over there. And I always ask the question, well, we currently have the 8% and petition. Do you think we should do away with that? And I haven't heard anybody validate that they want to do away with that, but there's always been this in place. The state creates most of these taxing entities and then gives them a tax base, but we have a duty to regulate once we create them. I just don't see the argument there. And the thing that I pointed out, in my op-ed was this bill was carried in 2005 by a Lubbock representative. I think he followed it in multiple sessions. It got voted on. Our senator at that time voted for it. It got voted overwhelmingly in both chambers. It didn't seem all that radical back then in 2005. In fact, the mayor at the time even came out and championed the rep for filing it and said it was this. And so it just kind of begs the question. It was really good in 2005. What's changed in 12 years?
Yeah. What do you think has changed?
It's a good question. I'm still I've got a big question mark and would love to hear back from people about that.
There are some who, when it comes to property taxes and the complaint over property taxes, and I know the state's wanting to do stuff, who say, well, we could have better property taxes if we spent more on education. Kind of comes back to the education funding and property taxes and how much people are spending. Talk about that for a little bit and that relationship.
Sure. So, probably the largest part of most people's tax bill is what's going to actually go to their ISDs. And, the question becomes, I guess the argument that's being made is if we had a money tree in Austin and we shook it and we put a whole bunch of money into, ISDs that, there you could potentially, lower property taxes.
Right. If the state spent more on education funding.
And there is some plans that I think have a lot of merit to do a swap from property taxes at what the state funds. The state doesn't have a property tax. Let me make sure that's very clear. But we do put money, of course, into public education. But rather than relying as much on property taxes, doing a swap to some more consumption tax. You can't completely do away with it. The numbers don't make sense. I think it's like a 24% sales tax. We would never have retail left if we did that. But there are a couple pennies. I think you could do that to buy it down. So there is some validity to an overall tax plan. I think you're going to see that come back from a education finance committee that we appointed from this last session that will come back with recommendations on that point. So the two are tied together. But for a lot of people who just say, okay, spend more money on public education and buy down property taxes, I think you have to ask the follow-up question, where's that going to come from? Are you going to cut services? Are you going to put more taxes in? A lot of people I hear who are advocating for that position really want an income tax, and I'm completely against that. Yeah. Horrible idea.
And there's a set amount of money. There's a pool of money, and education is one of the things that's it's one of the largest portions of the budget. Correct?
It's always been the largest. However, it's dangerously close that Health and Human Services is becoming that. We need to really have a conversation about healthcare costs, Medicaid funding, what we're actually paying on these types of things. The biggest competition for state resources, whether it's competing against property tax relief, education dollars, transportation dollars, is what we're spending on that part of the budget. And, a few of us have been filing bills, multiple sessions now, trying to deal with the rising cost of healthcare to help deal with this problem.
Can you hang around one more segment?
Absolutely.
Great. When we come back, if you've got a question, I know we have one listener on hold. We'll get to your question with State Representative Dustin Burrows. Also, we'll find out what happens during the interim. These guys just kind of hang out, not do anything, not care about any statewide issues. Do they run for speaker? What do they do during the interim? We'll be right back. Chad Hasty Show, News Talk, 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. State Representative Dustin Burrows in studio with me for one more segment. Let's go to the phones. And, Brian, you have a question for Representative Burrows.
Yeah, this tax, excuse me. Good morning, gentlemen. I'm sorry to be so rude. I just got this on my mind, and I want to talk about it. I'm self-employed. I am approaching in on the 60 years old and looking at retirement. And I'm seeing my school taxes go through the roof. And I really don't have much of a way to control it besides voting for the people in the school district. And that's it. But when my taxes and insurance are more than my house payment, it begins to eat up my extra money. And I'm sorry, I have no problem with spending money on education. The problem is we've spent it on football fields and basketball arenas and nice-looking jerseys and new shoes every year and this and that. When I was at high school, I went to an all-guy private Catholic high school, and I can guarantee you the only thing that's changed in the gymnasium is the timekeeper clock and all that, and the baseball field is exactly the same. And they're always in the top rankings in Southern California for sports. The amount of money that we spend on extracurricular activities is beginning to outweigh the education. Are we really getting our education dollars worth these days? I don't feel like it.
Well, Brian, I appreciate your call. What you're saying, especially about property taxes and watching them rise, this is what I hear from all the time.
It's 80%. It's about 80% of my tax bill.
Yeah, these are the phone calls that I continue to get. I know many of my colleagues get. I can only assume the governor gets, which is why he's made this a priority item and why I supported last session, some reform measures. Is this the panacea? Is this the cure-all? Does this fix everything? No. It's a combination of things. If there was a silver bullet, I think we would have done it a long time ago. But this is part and parcel of Abbott's plan, and I do support it, and it's because of people like Brian that I hear from all the time that we need to do something about it. That's what we're elected to do. As conservatives, as Republicans, I think this is one of the big issues that people have sent us to Austin to try and work on.
Brian, thanks for the call. Appreciate it. In the next session, what's the likelihood that this gets through the next session? I know there will be a new speaker. There's going to be some new blood in the House. What's the likelihood this gets through?
I think it's high. I think it really is. You look at as long as we actually keep our Republican numbers up, we should be good to get it through. We voted on it in the House. We voted on it in the Senate. They passed it both. It didn't get to the governor's desk because of legislative shenanigans. That's a technical word, but there is broad-based support amongst Republicans. But November is going to make the determination. It really is, and it's one of the things the Democrats are betting on apathy. On our part, the conservatives aren't going to show up at the polls because we hold most of the levers of power. They're coming up with clever arguments. We have liberals running as conservatives all around the state, recruiting, and it's going to be up to us to get the message out and get our voters to the polls in November. And if we come back with good, strong numbers, again, we return Republicans, with strong numbers in both the House and the Senate, we're going to get this done. I feel very certain.
The governor has weighed in on a few of the different Republican primaries. Where he's gone through and endorsed. Are you shocked by that or surprised by that at all?
He said he was going to. I take the governor at his word. He's, every time he's told me he's going to do something, he's followed through. So I guess that's what he's doing. I know he weighed in on one early on and apparently one this morning. And, it's definitely a little different. But, Abbott
it's sort of if you don't support the Abbott, and it's not every single little part of the Abbott agenda, but if it's, hey, if you're standing in the way of, conservative policy and conservative agenda items, maybe I'll endorse your opponent. And I think some people are okay with that.
I can't speak to what his reasons are. I can only assume that he's looking around and saying, everyone who gets elected has a time clock. They have to get their agenda through. They've got to figure out how to get it done, and I assume that's what he's focused on.
Besides, I know you're running for re-election, of course. You do not have a primary opponent, but in the general election, you do have an opponent, a Democratic opponent. Besides running for re-election, what are you up to during the interim for state business?
Well, this is the point in time that get to kind of have a debriefing on what we did last session. We pretty much did that through the fall. Go meet with people throughout the district, get our bill ideas of what we can actually get done. Figure out what our priorities are as far as legislative priorities for next session. A lot of them, there are going to be some refiles that I've filed for 2 sessions now, but also some new ones. And so trying to get those and then, probably roll those out somewhere late summer, early fall. Also, I have 2 committees that are going to be meeting, the banking committee, international financial services, and agriculture. I assume that a lot of the topics are going to be the impact that Harvey has had on the state with banking and agriculture. One of the big things we're going to have to deal with next session is the financial fallout from just that massive, massive storm.
Yeah.
And we're ready for it.
When it comes to some of the bills that you've filed before, because you focused a lot on the medical side of things, with the individual mandate being repealed, with who knows what next year is going to look like for Obamacare overall. How big do you think going into 2019 that side of legislation is going to be?
It needs to be. Sometimes I say healthcare, and a lot of people want to run away because they know how complicated the subject is, and it's not an easy thing to actually fix. But I have some very detailed policy that I think will fix it and go a long ways to it. I had productive, conversations with a lot of different offices that I think are starting to come around with my way of thinking on this. And, I'm going to build support and, continue to try to get something massive done because, we just heard Brian calling about property taxes. The other thing I hear about all the time is I can't afford health insurance. That the cost of what it is just absolutely unaffordable. And to pay for it means people don't have retirement, they don't have savings, they can't live, they can't pay their mortgage. And we've got to fix it. We've got to actually start letting markets compete for business. And there's ways in which we can get that done. So I continue to talk to other members. I continue to talk to the governor's office and others and just try to lay out my plan. And I think it's a good one, and see if we can't get enough support to pass something next session.
Border funding. I brought up a story earlier from the New York Times, and again, it's probably a lot of anonymous sources who say the next budget could include cuts to patrol boats, to radar technology, to air surveillance, stuff like that. These are all things that the state of Texas is doing and paying Texas dollars to do. How is that working for the state of Texas right now? And is that funding for Texas taxpayers, is that funding going to continue, you think, past 2019?
So first off, I kind of stopped reading the New York Times a while back. I'm sure that anything could happen in the budget according to them. But look, we've had a lot of success in the border, and the metrics show it. Whether it's patrolling, putting the blimps, having the intelligence, just stepping it up. And you talk to people down on the border, and they will tell you there's been a lot of success. My wife has a ranch about 30 miles from the southern border. My in-laws spend most of their time down there, so we get to see it firsthand, and we know that it's made a huge difference. And I want to see those programs continue because it has an effect not only on crime, but also on the dollars that we spend, whether it's education, whether it's hospitals and everything else, and just the drug culture.
Yep. Representative Burrows, appreciate your time today, and we'll visit with you again later on.
Thank you, Chad.
All right. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO.